There's one event that has been probably the most important event that has happened in the last, you could even say probably 30, 40, 50 years in terms of waking up the population to things that go on in the world that aren't quite what they seem. 9/11, I would say, is probably the most potent example of this. And now we have a brand new study that has come out. It's been an ongoing study since early 2015, but now, they're at the draft stage. They're about to say, okay, we're going to submit this as our final draft. And this study is ultimately looking through computer models and determining that World Trade Center 7, which is the building, not the two tall buildings. A lot of people don't know what World Trade Center 7 is, but the two tall buildings that we saw, collapse within themselves on 9/11. There was a building just off to the side a little bit that a lot of people don't know about. It looked a little bit more like the average apartment building, you might say. And that one came down exactly within its own footprint as well. It was not hit by planes. It came down according to NIST, which is the official report that came out from the government, stating that this building fell due to fires that must have came from the other buildings and so forth, right? So it was just a matter of over time, this incredibly well built building with a steel structured frame and concrete came down due to fires. And people accepted that for a long time until people started to look at the video and started to realize, hey, this looks exactly like a controlled demolition through and through. You put a controlled demolition next to the collapse of this building, they look exactly the same. There's no difference. So people looked into that, right? And a lot of architects and engineers and intelligent people that had the means to, like at University of Alaska Fairbanks here, our study found that fires in World Trade Center 7 could not have caused the collapse recorded on video. We simulated every plausible scenario, and we found that the series of failures that NIST claimed triggered a progressive collapse of the entire structure could not have occurred. The only thing that could have brought this structure to the ground down in this manner observed on 9/11 is the near simultaneous failure of every column in the building below floor 17. So like I said, now this study, this is one of the conclusions made from the study, or the main conclusion made from the study, which again, looks at computer models. They've been doing this for a really long time. Last year, we re-reported on this again, and the year before that, we reported on it again, right? Kind of giving the updates as they've continued to investigate this over time. They were always open to various bits of feedback from the public. They're now doing that again on this draft before they submit it in November for official review. Now, the interesting thing about this is University of Alaska Fairbanks is actually stating here when they submit this, we're going to put all of our data open to the public. So what happens is in November, the public and other scientists are actually going to be able to look at all of this data and all of the models that they ran so that people can scrutinize and ultimately look at it and say, here's where we might have done it a little differently, or you know what, you're actually on point with this, or whatever it might be, they're going to make it all transparent and completely public. The reason why they did this is because NIST did not do this. So here you have a building that everybody with their own eyes looks at and says, hey, that looks like a controlled demolition. You say, well, that's fair, so we got to look into that, which somebody did. And now, when NIST initially looked into it, which is, again, this is the government-funded review of what happened on 9/11, you realize that they came out with a story that really just didn't make sense to a lot of architects and engineers out there. So when NIST was asked, why didn't you make the models? Why didn't you make how you came about these conclusions from a scientific perspective, from a physical and a structural engineering perspective? Why didn't you make that public? And NIST comes back saying, this would threaten sort of national security. I believe they actually said it would threaten public safety was the exact words that they used, which again, a classic sort of, you could say just deterrent that is often used by government or by various politicians when justifying actions that don't really seem to make sense, but seems to be okay with a lot of people because you're talking about public safety, right? Oh, why can't you release the information? Oh, it's a threat to national security. Oh, why did you lie about this for 50 years? Oh, because it was a threat to national security. Oh, we can't talk about this because it's a threat to national security, right? that term has been used for decades to justify the non-disclosure of information really that the public should have access to, information that has made policies and has made things happen in our world that really don't favor the public in any way, shape, or form, but really favor certain institutions that are high up on elite levels. So what you can determine from what NIST initially said is that clearly they're probably hiding something here. And I realize I just said clearly they're probably, but we know now that that probability of them hiding something is incredibly high now that we have studies like this, because studies like this are ultimately saying that we have a very, very good way of illustrating through computer models, through top, professionals in the space that have been involved in this, right? Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth was involved in this study and helped fund this study. There's thousands of architects and engineers who are part of that organization that would have access to reviewing this stuff, perhaps got on collaboration calls with the people that were at the university to figure out how to go through this more properly, right? So it's not like you're having some random conspiracy theorist sitting behind their computer trying to examine footage to say here's what happened. This is some of the best technology that's available to people to analyze this stuff. It's all here, it's all there, saying, hey, you know what? This is what we've determined and there's something going on here. So again, a very important study. Now, one thing I got to bring up here, because I talked about him in a previous episode about chemtrails, and I'm going to talk about him again because inevitably when you look up World Trade Center 7, or when anybody does, Metabunk, which is a website run by a guy by the name of Mick West, who back in 2017 was on Joe Rogan's show and kind of he does a very good job of questioning things and analyzing things. There's no denying that. I think in my observation, he seems to be somebody that reminds me of other individuals that I've spoken to in the past who are often, they're so stuck in a narrative of there's no possible way the government could be involved in per se wrongdoing or misleading the public knowingly, and therefore anything that they say has ultimate truth, and so the burden is always on the new evidence being brought forward to be 110 billion% foolproof, meaning even if I could poke the tiniest hole, which creates the tiniest little bit of doubt about the new evidence being brought forward, then ultimately the official story is still true, and this is just a crazy conspiracy theory in essence, right? And that's how I've observed that Mick West operates. At the same time, Mick West will oftentimes debunk conspiracy theories that really are not true. There are a ton of conspiracy theories out there that have zero truth to them. And this is why we say at Collective Evolution all the time, there's no point in walking around factually stating some of these conspiracy theories, because all it does is it waters down the reality of some conspiracy theories that are absolutely true and that need to be talked about and that have gigantic implications on society, and yet are kind of laughed at because of some of the other stuff that's out there. So it's a cultural thing, right? We're here to help implement or help encourage, you could say, a culture that is a little bit more grounded in what's actually going on and what's actually happening and stuff that can truly make a big difference on our society as we look through it. And so inevitably you're going to see, Mick West talk about this on Metabunk, and you're going to find some of this stuff. And one thing that you're going to see is that he has written an article about the early stages of this study on Metabunk. And one of the quotes that I thought was very interesting here to sort of sum up what I was just saying before was that while it is possible that Dr. Halsey's study will eventually yield some interesting results, it is factually incorrect to say that it proves that fire could not have caused the collapse. So ultimately what he's saying is, we think he knows, that NIST's official explanation that fire, caused the collapse, that still holds true. Even though they didn't reveal transparently exactly how they came about that truth, even though the physical evidence doesn't support that, he believes that to be the truth. And therefore it's on Dr. Halsey's study to, to say, hey, you got to prove that this is incorrect. And since Mick is able to, through a list of various things, poke tiny holes that may or may not be factual or be true in any particular way, because there's still things that are unfolding here, you can't say that that this building came down as a result of anything other than fire. So what you really see in these types of statements, and this is how a lot of people like Mick sort of kind of get away with the stuff that they do, not that anybody should be punishing them for it or anything, it's just more so it's about understanding the way the thought process functions, is that It's the type of sort of logical or scientific mind that is often looking for any tiny little hole to be able to say, well, therefore it's not a fact. It doesn't mean that is something that is being presented isn't true. It's just about saying, well, if there's this tiny 0.10% chance that this isn't true, then it's not a fact, and therefore it's probably not true. This is a very important story. There's a lot going on here, and of course the mainstream media has not touched this study. The only thing that I was able to find in any sort of mainstream type source was that Yahoo Finance released the the press release that the university had put out. So they were just reposting the press release. Other than that, there's no mainstream media mention of this, and this I think has been out for 4 or 5 days at this point. So what are we ultimately seeing at the end of the day? People are going to look at this and they're going to say, well, of course the mainstream media is not going to talk about this because this doesn't, the mainstream media is not going to touch something like this. Are you silly, Joe? Of course they're not. But that's you understand that from someone who's awake and aware. The average person, if you want to talk to them about this, you need to be able to say to them, isn't it interesting that the largest event in recent history that would be on the minds of pretty much any person in the world who was alive and able to understand current events, that understood what happened on 9/11. A study that comes out and says, hey, this official story is not accurate, and here's all the scientific data to prove this, coming out of a university, and the mainstream media is not supposed to touch that? Is that a story that you'd be interested in hearing about? Is that a conversation you would be interested in seeing the public discuss, or seeing a politician discuss, or somebody have to answer? Right? Why is this not talked about? Trump having a piece of toilet paper on his shoe is national news for a couple of days. A study like this is not even talked about. These are the questions you have to ask the average person who doesn't understand the degree of credibility that has gone into the research around 9/11, and the fact that the mainstream media completely and utterly goes silent on them. It's like, well, why? Are they told not to, right? Again, these aren't questions I'm asking you as an awake and aware viewer. These are questions you take to other people from a grounded point of view and say, these are the facts. The facts are this study exists, and the mainstream media does not want to talk about it. Why? They'll talk about things that are meaningless, completely and utterly meaningless for days. But they won't talk about stuff like this, biggest event in recent US history. Why? Right? This is the focus that I think we got to be taking to stuff like this, right? Because this is how you're going to get the average person to start connecting the dots and putting things together, not by saying, oh, you're a dumb sheeple, you don't realize that 9/11 was fake. Like, what are you, an idiot? That's not going to do anything for anybody. That's going to get people to shut down, right? That's what gets people like Mick West, right? And I'm not putting this guy down at all either. I'm just saying when people are out there doing what they're doing, when they're trying to raise awareness about 9/11 and they're aggressive and they're attacking and they're doing all this stuff, it's very easy to poke holes in that state of being. When someone's coming forward and say, hey, here's the data, here's the evidence, here are the facts, let's have a discussion. It's a lot harder to just say, these guys are all idiots. They're all crazy tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorists. So what culture are you contributing to? What world are you creating in how you talk about the stuff that is coming to light? That's a big reflection point here.